No, the Soviet Union is still with us, including, of course, in the country which used to be called the Soviet Union. The first state in history formed by the fusion of organized crime and secret police. Of the top Russian government officials, 84% have a KGB background. And that figure doesn't come from me. It comes from a pro-Putin sociologist in Russia. The rest are organized crime figures. But the rhetoric that emanates from Russia is music to conservative ears here. He talks about tradition. He talks about Christianity. He talks about a ban on homosexual marriage. He talks about all those good things are wonderful, but they have nothing to do with the nature of the Putin regime. The nature of the Putin regime is to rob the country blind, transfer all the money to the West, and keep doing it until it stays in power, which means it wants to stay in power for as long as possible. And to stay in power, it needs to keep the population in check. And since the population is impoverished, something like 65% of the Russians live below the poverty level. The poverty level there is about £200 a month. Most of the countries is below that. It's a well-known stratagem used by many tyrants to replace food in people's stomachs with drumbeat and bugles, with war. If we're poor, it's not because we don't know how to run our affairs, but because of, and then fill in your own blank. In this case, it's the United States. The Anglo-Saxons, they're using the term Anglo-Saxons these days. And they're not using it as a compliment. The mistake people are making, those so-called conservatives, are making, is that they are comparing the rhetoric of one side with the practice of the other. And that's not a fair comparison. You got to compare practice with practice. I mean, there are more political prisoners in Russia by an order of magnitude than there were in Brezhnev's Soviet Union, for example. Prisoners are tortured, they're beaten, they're raped with broom handles, which is a widespread sort of method of interrogation these days. Russia pounces on her neighbors. It's an awful, awful state. But the rhetoric is good. I mean, Christianity, it was very funny because you understand that they were all Communist Party members, and Communist Party members cannot be Christians. I mean, it's kind of... It's sort of like the Archbishop of Canterbury being an atheist, which actually, come to think of it, well, I wouldn't go into that. But since God, King, and Country has to be their new slogan rather than proletarians of the world unite, they had to become Christians overnight, and they started crossing themselves before government meetings. But somebody had forgotten to tell them that in the Orthodox tradition, you cross yourself from right to left, because they saw this gesture in American films, where of course you cross from left to right. And so they started crossing themselves from left to right until somebody actually told them, boys, you got it wrong. I mean, and of course the church, that's another thing that attracts Western conservatives, the supposed strength of the Orthodox Church in Russia. Well, the Orthodox Church has been an extension of the KGB, of the secret police, for a long time. The current patriarch, head of the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church, is a career KGB agent. There's plenty of documentary evidence to that. His KGB code name was Agent Mikhailov. When he stood in the election for that post, I think it was 10 years ago, something a bit more, maybe 12 years ago, there were two candidates standing against him, and both were KGB agents as well. All that, by the way, came out in the Mitrokhin archives, fundamental two-volume book head of the archive department of the KGB, managed to escape with the films of all those documents, a definitive work. Putin's personal confessor, Shakunov, was the abbot of a monastery in Moscow. And about 5 years ago, it was discovered that the Holy Fathers were running a brothel in the monastery and charging something like $20 a throw, which suggests that they were oriented towards a high volume operation rather than high quality. You know, I've spoken to conservative groups a lot. There's another factor, of course, that Putin's government actually finances so-called right-wing groups, which I don't see as right-wing at all, actually, like Marine Le Pen's people in France, like Alternative for Germany, and so on and so forth. An interesting example from my own practice, if I may. 2 years ago, I was interviewed by Radio Courtoisie, which is basically Marine Le Pen's radio station. It positions itself as conservative, but in my view, it's not. Anyway, it was recorded, and the interviewer was very happy, and it was supposed to go on air. Now, 15 minutes before airtime, she rang me and said that the head of the station spiked it because he doesn't want to offend the Russian embassy. That's a French radio station, you know, suppressing an interview because the Russian embassy would be offended. Essentially, they try to fish in troubled waters, and they try to trouble waters as much as possible, which is why they're financing practically every splinter group they can find. Peter Hitchens is my very frequent target because he's a Putinista par excellence. He wrote some 10 years ago that Putin's government is the most conservative and Christian in Europe. And then, since then, he's been denying everything, that they didn't poison anybody, there's no proof. They're actually hitting people with radioactive substances right here in Britain, in London and Salisbury. But that has absolutely no effect on those people, like this chap that you spoke to. I mean, a good man otherwise, as these people very often are, but misguided in the worst possible way. They're misguided by their emotions, their understanding of the fact that it's strictly an emotional need to find an example of virtue where none exists domestically. That's the nature of their attraction to the truly evil regime. But that's another thing, you see, where I use the E word, you know, which is not allowed any longer in common parlance, you know, evil. People don't think in absolute terms. We've become consummate relativists. Everything is relative. There's no such thing as absolutes, which incidentally affects the very, very same reason in whose name the modern world was inaugurated in the first place. The greatest achievement of Western thought sprang from the realization that there is such a thing as absolute truth, and approximating it as closely as possible is the task of any kind of cognitive process. That has disappeared, and Western thought, Western reason, thereby lost its teleological aspect. Suddenly it has nowhere to go, which explains the abysmal level of intellectual discourse in the academy, in the press, and everywhere else. When I talk to my French friends, I say, you reached your cultural and intellectual peak in the 13th century and it's been downhill ever since. They don't like that. Just compare the University of Paris of the 13th century with Albert the Great, you know, Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas and people like that. Compare that with today's University of Paris, you know, Sorbonne. That's all you need to do. Don't do anything else. You have to believe that the chap who runs the philosophy department at the Sorbonne constitutes progress compared to Thomas Aquinas. And if you don't believe that, then your whole cultural religion falls apart.
Your comment about evil there was really important. You say that evil has a lifelong lease in the human soul and hatred is more common than love. What are the implications of that for the Mod Man project?
Very telling ones. all revolutions, including the modern revolution, the destruction of the traditional Western ethos and replacement and that with something else, was driven by the desire of creating not only a new world, but actually a new man. All revolutions want to change the essence of man. And in that respect, all modernity is driven by a Rousseauian understanding of what man is. Here's a quotation from his Du Contrat Social. The state should be able to take from the man his own resources and give him instead new ones alien to him and incapable of being made use of without the help of others. The more completely those inherited resources are annihilated, the greater and more lasting are those which he acquires. That is the blueprint for modernity, and all modern states are Rousseauian. Rousseau, of course, proceeded from the assumption that man was inherently good, beautiful in his primordial virtue, and he is the noble sauvage, the noble savage, a clean slate on which the liberal message could be inscribed. And he can only be corrupted by civilization, meaning by Christendom, and therefore Christendom should be destroyed, and this beautiful, naturally good, but tautologically further perfectible man can display his greatness. Now, of course, the traditional Christian concept of man is entirely different. Judeo-Christian, as a matter of fact, it starts with the concept of original sin, that man was corrupted by original sin. Therefore, the purpose of life is to overcome the consequences of that by the lifelong virtuous exercise of free will. These are fundamental problems. To say that man is essentially sinful and has to do something to overcome that is entirely different, fundamentally different from saying that the man is inherently good. Let him be. Since, in my view, modern world was animated to a very large extent by its hatred towards tradition, that kind of tallies, paradoxically, with the Christian understanding of man, because that exists. Evil exists. It's resident now so. Whereas love, especially the kind of love demanded by Christ, love of not only one's neighbor, but also one's enemy. We're supposed to love even our enemies, which, by the way, doesn't preclude us from fighting them. But that's a different, that's a theological discussion. And so hatred and resentment are very natural emotions to which an aspiring totalitarian state can appeal, and which he might try to activate, because that's how it can unite the people that have nothing else to unite them. A desire for 6-week holidays is not strong enough for society to cohere into a single unity. There has to be a bogeyman, somebody to keep at bay or to fight, ideally to kill. And the bogeyman is, of course, what's left of the Christian tradition, of the Western tradition. Whereas Christian love, I mean, it's very difficult for anyone, and I don't accept maybe a saint, actually to love one's enemy. That demand that Christ made on man was almost impossible to satisfy. And in order to satisfy it, very serious effort had to be made. It could not have happened naturally. You couldn't just say, look at somebody like, I don't know, in my case, Putin, and say, well, I love him. You can't do that naturally. It has to come from a much higher authority than anyone available to man's own resources.
It's one of the remnants of what you call Westman's treasure, the exhortation to do that. And you say all we can do now is try to keep vigil over that treasure. What are some of the ways that you think people can do that?
It has to be an individual quest. because collectively we can do nothing at all. One has to use oneself as a bulwark, the last line of defense against the perversions of modernity. And that means pouring scorn, as I so often do, on all the modern perversions such as pop music, pop art of any kind, also protecting our language. That's essential to fight glossocracy by insisting that every word has to be used in its own meaning. That's part of the last ditch defense, an attempt to protect the treasure. That's the English language, which is at the moment suffering egregious attrition. So that's another thing we can do. Correct people's usage, even at the risk of getting punched in the face. Try to use the language properly ourselves. Those are the only things. Because if we don't do it, nobody will. And if nobody does, the wheel of history will never turn back. It will have nowhere to turn to. If everything is completely destroyed, dead and buried, then there's nothing to come back to. It has to be an internal one-man resistance, because you can't go to the public with that, because you won't get access. I've gotten trouble with every editor I ever worked with every publisher. The word conservative is widely used in the UK, usually in the meaning of the Conservative Party. But the question is, what is it that you would like to conserve? What would you like to preserve? When that question is asked, for example, it's unclear how an American can be a political conservative, for example. An American can be a cultural conservative, but not a political one, because what is it that he wants to conserve? The notion that all men are created equal. That's an Enlightenment construct that has nothing to do with reality. I mean, Americans don't like hearing that. I remember when I wrote my book largely on American democracy, the neocon trick, neoconservatism, and all that. The reviewers in America were perplexed. I mean, how could you say that? American democracy is gone. Winthrop, the first chap who landed on Plymouth Rock, immediately quoted from Matthew. He said, "This is a shining city on a hill, and it's supposed to light up the path for the world to follow." It's a messianic state, but for all the references to Christianity there, it's a secular messianic state. It wants to attract people not with the kind of path that the apostles were supposed to shine on the world in St. Matthew, but it's supposed to attract the world with motorways, large cars, Coca-Cola, the McDonald's, and widespread prosperity. American conservatives find themselves in dire straits when conservatism is discussed. In France, I would say that the word conservative in the English sense of the word doesn't exist. I mean, the word exists, but not the concept. I mean, who there is conservative? Which political party in France has ever been conservative? The Gaullists certainly not, and they're by far the closest party to that. Marine Le Pen is socialist. I mean, if you look at their economic ideas, they could have come from the Soviet Union. Equality, another shibboleth of modernity, of course, that comes from the French Revolution, that equality is a desirable and achievable objective, an objective achievable by political means, which is why Boris Johnson is talking absolute bilge when he talks about leveling up. The state cannot level up. Down is the only direction in which the state can level. So any attempt to level up will eventually become leveling down. And the zeal with which that sort of program is applied determines how quickly leveling up will become leveling down. But you see, it's by now, this idea of equality as a desirable and achievable objective is built into the DNA of modern man, which is why it was inscribed in the Declaration of Independence, along with pursuit of happiness. Happiness has since then replaced virtue as the ultimate purpose of existence, as it were. Happiness was never an objective for the Christian mind. Our civilization started with a man dying on the cross and suffering on the cross. So suffering is the founding aspect of our civilization. We're not Buddhists, you know. When Buddha walked out of his house and he saw an old man at a funeral and a poor man, he realized that there was suffering, and therefore the world that allowed that suffering was evil, you know, and the only way to handle that is to escape from it. And now Christianity, unlike Buddhism, teaches salvation of the world, not from the world.
The comment you made about suffering there might well be the reason why Westman, when suffering surfaces, as undoubtedly it will, as history shows, might be able to endure where modman can't. Westman can swim in suffering almost as a second element.
You're putting it extremely well. I agree. I mean, a modern man kind of feels that if he suffers, that invalidates his whole existence. Hence this preoccupation with health, you know, with personal health. They want to be immortal because Christianity showed an exact way to achieve immortality, but that's not good enough because that transcends physical existence, and nothing these days is supposed to transcend physical existence.
The stress on the importance of language there answers a question that people often ask me, actually. Why is an English teacher involved in this battle? And the reason is that it came to me first as an English teacher. The assault is on that front. Ernst Robert Curtius in European literature and the Latin Middle Ages defined literature as the intellectual and spiritual tradition of the West as given form in language. So it makes complete sense that somebody who is tasked with transmitting that and conserving it has been under attack, in the same way that critical theory has aimed at hollowing out that tradition through its emphasis on nihilism and deconstruction. We've got the same battle being fought in society more broadly in this particular discipline, English.
English teachers are in the forefront, or rather, they're fighting rearguard action. But it's amazing that those deconstructionist philosophers, and it pains me to refer to them as philosophers, but they argued the uselessness of language. But the argument was expressed in language, you know. So that kind of inner contradiction doesn't occur to them, you know. That what they mean is that everybody else's language is irrelevant. It's like the socialists talking about equality. What they mean is that everybody else should be equal to one another, with them towering above them and looking down on everybody from their dizzying height, from their high moral ground.
Exactly. And that's a theme that you've pointed to throughout many of your answers, self-contradiction as a touchstone of error. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your hard-won wisdom with everybody. And it's been a most enjoyable interview.
My pleasure. I'm sorry if I was a bit incoherent here and there.
Not at all. I think it was very articulate. And these are thoughts that are not easily available elsewhere. So much appreciated.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.